Yeah. Good evening, everyone. The program is going to start now. Please mute yourself and, if possible, stop your video for better connectivity. And also, those who have not named themselves, please rename themselves, because there are names like Galaxy and then some numbers and all that. As per Zoom rules, you need to rename yourself. Please give your original name. Thank you. Meenal, over to you.
Thank you, Usha. So, good evening, all. I am Meenal Shirsagar. As chairperson of the Endowment Lectures Committee of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, I wish you a very happy new year and extend a warm welcome to you, to all of you, for the first endowment lecture to be held in 2021, the ninth Professor Dhirendra Narain Memorial Lecture. Today, we have the privilege of having with us Dr. Phiroze Vasunia, professor in the Department of Greek and Latin at University College London, to deliver his lecture, Memories of Empire. We also have the honor of having Professor Arjun Appadurai to preside. He is the Goddard Professor in Media, Culture and Communication at New York University and visiting professor at the Institute of European Ethnology at Humboldt University in Berlin. We are indeed grateful that these eminent scholars who have received international acclaim for their contribution to the academic world have agreed to grace this occasion. Thank you both. Uh, I will now give you a brief introduction to the Professor Dhirendra Narain Endowment Lecture. So today's lecture is the ninth endowment lecture in his memory. Professor Dhirendra Narain retired in 1991 as head of the famed Department of Sociology at the University of Mumbai. He was a leading academic at this department and progressed from being lecturer to reader to professor and head of department. His areas of interest were many, but the sociology of knowledge was one for which his lectures were renowned both in India and overseas. He had been offered faculty positions in other prestigious Indian and American universities, but chose to remain at his cherished Department of Sociology at the University of Mumbai. His writings were numerous. One notably was his first book, Hindu Character, which was based on his doctoral thesis under the guidance of the renowned Professor Gurier. The memorial volume of essays on Professor Kapadia and the masterly assessment of Professor Gurier was regarded as a scholarly tribute to his teachers. The Dr. G.D. Parikh volume was edited and published jointly by Dr. Narayan and Dr. S.H. Deshpande in 1979. He was always available to students and colleagues to help in academic and other matters relating concerning sociology. So he was a guru in the true sense of the word. This endowment was instituted following a generous donation by Dr. Vatsala Narayan, his wife, and also a noted sociologist. We are grateful to her and wish to acknowledge our thanks to her as we do every year when the lecture is held. Uh, our speaker for today, I welcome you, Dr. Phiroze Vasunia. He is also a Mumbaite. He studied initially at the University of Bombay, but he's just told me that he was there for just a year and then he went off to the US. He may tell you a little more. He graduated in 1985 and subsequently obtained his PhD degree in 1996 from Stanford University. He was assistant professor of classics at the University of Southern California till 2003 and later assistant professor of classics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill till 2005. Subsequently, he was professor of classics at the University of Reading in the UK until 2014 and currently he is a professor in the Department of Greek and Latin at University College London. He has several awards and publications to his credit and has delivered many lectures at institutions around the world. Dr. Vasunia has research and teaching interests in the study of cross-cultural contact, colonialism, and empire. His works include The Gift of the Nile 2001 and The Classics and Colonial India 2013, among numerous other publications which are too long. The list is too long to enumerate. Edited books include Zarathustra and the Religion of Ancient Iran, Greek and Latin Sources and Translation 2007, the Oxford Handbook of Hellenic Studies 2009, and Classics and National Cultures 2010. He's the general editor of the book series Ancients and Moderns. Forthcoming volumes include The Politics of Form in Greek Literature and the Oxford Handbook of the Literatures of the Roman Empire. A current work in progress is a monograph on colonialism and the study of antiquity. So that's your speaker for today. I now have the pleasure of introducing Professor Arjun Appadurai. I've tried to make it brief, but really I cannot leave out many details which I would like to share with everyone. So I'll take a deep breath and I'll start. He is the Goddard Professor in Media, Culture and Communication at New York University, where he is also a Senior Fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge. He is a visiting professor at the Institute for European Ethnology at Humboldt University in Berlin. He also serves as honorary professor in the Department of Media and Communication, Erasmus University, Rotterdam, and as a senior research partner at the Max Planck Institute for Religious and Ethnic Diversity, Göttingen, Germany. He was previously senior advisor for global initiatives at the New School in New York City, where he also held a distinguished professorship as the John Dewey Distinguished Professor in the Social Sciences. Arjun Appadurai was the provost and vice president for academic affairs at the New School from 2004 to 2006. He was formerly the William K. Landman Jr. Professor of International Studies, Professor of Anthropology, and Director of the Center on Studies and Globalization at Yale University. Appadurai is the founder of PUCAR, Partners for Urban Knowledge Action and Research, a non-profit organization based in Mumbai. During his academic career, he has also held professorial chairs at Yale University, the New School, the University of Chicago, and the University of Pennsylvania, and has held visiting appointments at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, the University of Delhi, the University of Michigan, the University of Amsterdam, Erasmus University, Columbia University, and Oxford University. He is currently a Mercator Fellow as part of a major research project at the University of Siegen, the Free University, and Potsdam University, all in Germany. He has authored numerous books and scholarly articles, including Fear of Small Numbers, an essay on the geography of anger, Modernity at Large, Cultural Dimensions of Globalization, and The Future as a Cultural Fact, Essays on the Global Condition, and Banking on Words, The Failure of Language in the Age of Derivative Finance. His most recent book, co-authored with Neta Alexander, is Failure, published in 2019. His books have been translated into French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Japanese, Chinese, Italian, Turkish, and Arabic. He was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1997. And in 2013, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by Erasmus University in the Netherlands. I could go on and on enumerating all the honors has received, but I must not. He's also a Bombayite, born and brought up in our city. I end by saying that he has been a dear personal friend of our family for many long years, and we are very proud to talk about that. Welcome back, Arjun, to the Asiatic, since you have already been a speaker here before. And I now hand over the proceedings to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Meenal, for those all too generous remarks. I'm excited myself to be part of this occasion, even though we all have to use this strange technology. And I'm very eager to hear Professor Vasunia's remarks. So without any further ado, since we will have time for some comments by me and then a Q&A session with the audience, let me simply give the floor, so to speak, to Professor Vasunia. Phiroze, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Um, Thank you for the warm introduction, Minal. It's wonderful to see you and to address you this afternoon, even if we can see each other only online. I'm very deeply honored to be delivering the Dhirendra Narain Endowment lecture to you today. I've spoken at other venues in Mumbai, even spoken at the Asiatic Society in London, but not at the Asiatic Society in Mumbai. And I grew up in Mumbai, as you heard, and the Asiatic Society is the first learned society that I encountered. And my aunt, actually my father's cousin, technically, Mani Kamerkar, as we were just discussing a little while ago, was a devoted member of the society. And of course, the magnificent building and library made an impression on me from a very early age. Very happy memories of being in the Asiatic Society building, and like you, I'm disappointed that we can't meet there today. But I hope that one day in the not too distant future that we shall have the pleasure of living in a time when we can meet and visit each other more freely. Before I turn to my lecture, I'd like to extend my profound thanks to a few people. Please forgive me if I leave out someone who has also helped with the lecture. I'd like to thank Dr. Sherna Nalwala and Mr. Rashid Wadia for suggesting my name as a lecturer to the Asiatic Society and for remaining in touch despite the circumstances of the last 1 year. If I'm not mistaken, Sherna's very generously suggested that I speak in Mumbai about 6 or 7 years ago, and I'm glad this occasion has now come to pass. I'm also very grateful to Professor Meenal Shirsagar. She's been a very efficient coordinator of this event, dealt with all my emails very courteously and put up very patiently with my slow correspondence. And of course, thank you for that very warm and generous introduction as well. Thanks to Professor Professor Vijay Lakshmi for the formal invitation to deliver the lecture. And lastly, I'm flattered that Arjun Appadurai agreed to chair the event. I've been an admiring reader of his work for many years, and I'm honored that he's here presiding over our meeting today. I'm going to show some slides as well as we talk, and I hope that I'm able to move in and out of the slides seamlessly, but please bear with me if there are any glitches on that front. So, memories of empire. Let's begin with someone who thought a lot about memory and also a little bit about ancient Rome. Let's begin with Freud, that is to say, and in particular with civilization and its discontents. As I say, let's begin with civilization and its discontent. Remember that Freud, in Civilization and Its Discontents, had turned to Rome in order to show how the past lingered on in the minds of human beings. He first conjured up a vision of the city as it might have been experienced in his own day, the city of Rome, that is. This was a modern metropolis in which contemporary buildings and old ruins coexisted, and in which the discerning observer could find traces of different histories. In this city, further remnants lay undetected beneath the surface, antiquities that might one day be brought to the surface again and restored. But Freud then summoned up a second kind of Rome. He says, now let us, by a flight of imagination, suppose that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity with a similarly long and copious past. An entity, that is to say, in which nothing that has once come into existence will have passed away, and all the earlier phases of development continue to exist alongside the latest one. In this city, buildings of various periods would all be standing intact, some of them in the same place, somehow cohabitating without the displacement of any older structures. In the place occupied by the Palazzo Caffarelli would once more stand, without the palazzo having to be removed, the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. And this not only in its latest shape as the Romans of the empire saw it, but also in its earliest one, when it still showed Etruscan forms and was ornamented with terracotta antefixes. All these palaces, temples, and monuments would be visible to an observer who would perhaps only have to change the direction of his glance or his position in order to call up the one view or the other. No sooner did Freud offer up the metaphor of Rome as a psychical entity than he began to back away from it. This Rome was a fantasy, Freud said, and depended on a scenario that was unimaginable and even absurd. Such a city did not exist, and it was impossible to represent it, at least in spatial terms. And of course, I can't show you a picture of such a city on the PowerPoint either. Besides comparing the human mind to a city, besides comparing the human mind to a city, to any urban settlement and not just the eternal city, was not feasible, and the friable quality of a city would make it unsuitable for a comparison of the kind undertaken by the analyst. Freud went on to disavow the analogy between Rome and the mind, although he also stated the fact that it is the rule rather than the exception for the past to be preserved in mental life. Readers have wondered why Freud included this description of Rome if he was going to deny its validity for the argument of civilization and its discontents. Various explanations have been put forward, including one by Ellen Oliensis, who suggests that Freud's text shows how large-scale feelings of desire and aggression lie behind imperial expansion. For Freud, the ego feeling of maturity coexists with the survival of an infantile ego feeling, which is a much more inclusive, indeed an all-embracing feeling, which corresponded to a more intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. This infantile ego feeling, Freud suggests, lies behind the oceanic feeling to which he refers in Civilization and Its Discontents. In presenting to his readers the archaeologist's dream or nightmare of total preservation in his second description of Rome, Freud is also providing an example of the mature adult's desire to reconnect to that oceanic feeling. The psychoanalyst's Rome embodies the imperious desire to reabsorb the world the infant had perforce to let go. As Oliensis puts it, the oceanic feeling resurfaces as the sensation of Roman imperialism, and Freud's city stands for an aggressive fantasy of complete possession in time and space. It's this imperial problematic, so well explored by Latin poets such as Virgil, that Freud could not bring himself quite to write out of his Aeneid, namely Civilization and Its Discontents. One way of understanding Freud's use of Rome in Civilization and Its Discontents is to read it as an acknowledgement of the difficulties involved in recalling the past and in finding ways of comprehending it satisfactorily. But Freud's peculiar deployment of Rome suggests that more is at issue than infantile memory. Many, if not most, of Freud's references to Roman buildings refer to the period of rise to world historical importance and to the era when it becomes established as the imperial capital par excellence. Approached from this perspective, Freud's disavowal implies that memories of empire are not easy to explore, that they frustrate the best efforts to represent them, and that metaphors or rhetorical figures are unlikely to provide adequate models for exploring the imperial past. Neither the initial example of contemporary Rome nor the turbocharged image of permanence that he constructs is sufficient for the purpose of working through what an imperial experience felt like in the past and what it might mean for the present and the future. Memories of empire are not cities, not like cities or palimpsests or chronotopic structures that can be easily accessed and analyzed. Such memories can be impactful, but also complex and indirect, and their recollection is never pure and simple, but frequently uncertain, fallible, contested, and difficult. An additional implication of Freud's work is that memories can be construed expansively, so that Freud's description of Rome can itself count as a memory of the city. Broadening out the term in this fashion is not inconsistent with historiographical developments in the 20th and 21st century, when historians have become familiar with concepts such as collective memory, social memory, and historical memory, and have explored the significance of
आज WhatsApp कौन नहीं यूज करता पर क्या आपने सोचा है कि किसी WhatsApp पे Chinese President Xi Jinping's desperate bid to punish Australia is taking a heavy toll on China's economy.
Freud himself provided an example of what has subsequently been called mnemohistory in Moses and Monotheism, a book which tries to show how the effects of historical trauma have lingered among the Jewish people for centuries. Let us therefore take the expression memories of empire in a very broad sense. Memories of empire are individual and collective. They seep into narratives that are historical and fictional, pictorial and verbal. They can be found a generation after the event or a millennium.
Activity. In fact, there is a chain of events that have put China in a tight spot. Last year, Xi started imposing tariffs and other trade barriers on different Australian products, including barley, wine, beef, timber, lamb, and lobster. Beijing initiated the tariff war following a major
I'm sorry.
Okay, let's no problem. Let's carry on.
Yeah, I'm just dealing with that.
I think I was saying that memories of empire are various and complicated and diverse. They can be individual, collective. They can be pictorial, verbal. They can be found a generation after the event or a millennium. Events may be forgotten or repressed, and an individual or group may feel a compulsion to act out or work through what has been forgotten. At times, what is forgotten may be displaced or transformed into narratives that bear little correspondence to the past. For these reasons, any discussion of memories of empire remains challenging and tentative. This expression, the expression memories of empire, is intelligible in at least two ways. In the sense that I've been using it, the phrase can denote the memories that people or groups have of empires in the past. So, my relatives' reminiscences about India during the period of British rule fall into this category, as do recollections by any number of others who were alive during the Raj. There are parallels, of course, with other colonial cultures. A Kenyan waiter in Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama remembers that the same people who control the land before independence still control the same land, that he still cannot eat in the restaurants or stay in the hotels that the white man has built. His memory of empire is framed by the realization that, as in the colonial days, small elites control a disproportionate share of the country's resources and that inequalities of wealth persist. Numerous studies attest to the pride, melancholia, nostalgia, guilt, and shame felt by the French or the British after the loss of their colonies in the 20th century. Such feelings were prompted in part by recollections of empires that once existed. National traditions, ceremonies, and archives are frequently built around such memories of the imperial past. But construe the genitive in a subjective rather than an objective sense, construe that genitive of empire in a subjective rather than in an objective sense, and you grasp a different implication of the term memories of empire. And in this meaning, empire itself is said to have memories. What memories does empire have? Empire has a memory of empire. To illustrate the matter in simple terms, one might point out that Samudragupta's Allahabad pillar inscription, a foundational document of the self-expression of imperial polity in the Sanskrit cosmopolis, was engraved on a pillar used by Ashoka to display two of his edicts. The pillar was then exploited after some centuries by the Mughal emperors Akbar and Jahangir, and has prompted observers to proclaim that it embodies 2 millennia of Indian political charisma. Or one might deploy another chain of linked instances and say that the French and British empires looked back to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire recalled Alexander the Great, and Alexander himself sought to emulate the kings of Persia. But so bold a sequence barely does justice to the phenomenon, which needs to be analyzed conceptually and in detail, and to which we can merely allude this afternoon. At any rate, both senses of the term memories of empire will be relevant as we explore its associations in this paper. Let's turn to Alexander. Around him, the whole dream world of the East took shape and substance. Of him, every old story of a divine world conqueror was told afresh. More than 80 versions of the Alexander romance in 24 languages have been collected, some of them the wildest of fairy tales. No other story in the world has spread like his, as Tan, W.W. Tan, once put it. Every subsequent conqueror and conqueror manqué has remembered Alexander III, the Great of Macedon. His memory has never passed into oblivion. So many rulers of so many countries have called themselves Alexander, Iskandar, Sikandar after him, that it would be impossible to arrive at an exact count. The inhabitants of parts of northwest India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan still claim descent from him and his soldiers. Kipling's Man Who Would Be King gains much of its plot and popularity from this conceit. In Kipling's youth, Kafiristan was the subject of intense colonial interest because Britons perceived a connection, which was encouraged by many locals, between the Kafirs and the Greco-Macedonian settlers in the region. Perhaps Alexander's only historical rival is Julius Caesar, but already for Romans such as Caesar, Alexander had set a demanding precedent. Some Romans tried to walk in the footsteps of Alexander. A few of the inhabitants of Pompeii walked on him, or rather on his likeness. The Alexander Mosaic is a floor mosaic that was originally part of the exedra of the first peristyle in the so-called House of Faun, the Casa del Fauno in Pompeii. It dates to the late 2nd century BC and now forms part of the collection of the National Archaeological Museum in Naples. The mosaic was discovered in October 1831. At the time, the House of the Faun was known as the House of Goethe, Casa di Goethe, in honor of the poet who had visited the site in 1787, just when German Romanticism had transformed the classical world in its image, largely through the agency of Goethe's genius. Goethe added a drawing made by Wilhelm Zahn of the mosaic to his collection in Weimar not long after his death. The words he wrote down on receiving the drawing are frequently quoted, and I quote again, "The present and the future will not succeed in commenting in a manner worthy of this artistic wonder, and we must always return after studying and investigating it to simple, pure admiration. Goethe thought that attaching his own name to this house in Pompeii was an echo from the past meant to temper the loss of my son, as he put it. The house of Alexander for the death of a son. What would Freud say? In fact, the young Freud had been enthusiastic about Alexander and advocated successfully that his younger brother be named after the Macedonian conqueror. Much later, Freud was to write to Jung, Carl Jung, "Just rest easy, my dear son Alexander. I will leave you more to conquer than I myself have managed, all psychiatry and the approval of the civilized world, which regards me as a savage." The deeply Oedipal undertones of this remark are evident. The remark also casts an informative light on Freud's original desire to name his brother Alexander in the first place, as if to displace his own Oedipal feelings towards his father. Freud's statement illustrates to us that Alexander often appears in Oedipal relationships and that he's used to address issues of power, conquest, and desire. It's simplistic to say that the Romans' fascination with Alexander had an Oedipal element to it. Yet, whatever commenting in a manner worthy of the Alexander mosaic might look like, any such commentary would have to take into account the interpretive ambiguity of the image, an ambiguity that renders the image at once admiring and hesitant in its stance towards Alexander. On the one hand, the mosaic represents a scene from a battle that Alexander won and pays tribute to the victor and to his subjugations of the Persians at Gaugamela and elsewhere. On the other hand, the mosaic undercuts Alexander's triumph and calls into question the value of his conquests. Just to clarify here, this figure on the left is Alexander, and this figure here towards the center, but a bit to the right, is Darius, the Persian ruler. The prominence given to the Persian king Darius is extraordinary. Critics such as Ernst Badian have said that he dominates the action, and Darius assuredly seems to rise above the fray in his chariot. The look of horror on his face is brought on by the self-sacrifice of his fellow nobles and shows him as a sympathetic ruler distraught at the loss of his countrymen. By contrast, Alexander is leaning away from his enemy and his helmet has been knocked off his head. He is, to put it bluntly, I'm quoting a scholar here, he is, to put it bluntly, a man who has lost his hat. Badian writes, the representation as a whole may justly be called not merely not heroic, but deliberately unheroic. Moreover, the figural counterpart to the figural counterpart to Darius over here is not Alexander, but a dead tree. Badian reads the tree as a symbol of the destruction and denudation caused by Alexander's war and for the vanity of human and especially of heroic effort. For him, the centrality and symbolism of the tree is suggested not by Greek or Roman artistic precedent, but by Persian hunting scenes in Paradisoi depicted in Asia Minor. Far from promoting Alexander's success over the Persians, the mosaic emphasizes the sorrow of the Persians and the emptiness of the conqueror's accomplishment. The location of this mosaic complicates our understanding of the work's reception in antiquity. Pompeii was notionally not a Roman town in the late 2nd century BC, and the Pompeians obtained Roman citizenship only in the 1st century BC. The owner of the house may have been from Samnium, as some have suggested, and may have had pro-Roman or anti-Roman views or views that were ambivalent about Rome. Even the fact that the mosaic was on the floor of the peristyle adds to the indeterminacy of meaning. In a book about the Roman Alexander, Diana Spencer says, the most fundamental instability for this mosaic is its openness to a multiplicity of angles of gaze. It's on the floor beneath the feet of any who enter the room from the peristyle from which it opened. This vast mosaic provides an Alexander who can be trampled upon, turned on his head, or sideways, who can be a decorative addendum to a garden, or its focal point, all at the whim of the course strolled by the viewer. One could even potentially excise Alexander altogether and gaze from one garden to the next without dropping one's eyes to the floor. It hardly needs to be added that Darius too could have been trampled upon by anyone in the room. That the mosaic presents so conflicted a response to Alexander indicates that on the Italian peninsula by the 1st century BC, he was being remembered not solely as an invincible soldier, but also as a symbol of vanity and the transience of military success. Let's now place another image alongside the Alexander mosaic, a painting not from the Roman era, but made by an empire that never ceased to recall the Romans and their imperial accomplishments. I like this painting so much that I put it on the cover of a book that I wrote called The Classics and Colonial India, which came out in 2013, as you were generously reminded in Meenal's introduction. The East, let's see if I can bring it up, excuse me. The East, this is not the painting in question. The painting in question was in this building, the East India House at Leadenhall Street. This painting used to be part of the ceiling of the Revenue Committee room in East India House, and now can be found near the top of a stairway in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London. When the East India House building in Leadenhall Street was torn down, the painting was removed from the ceiling and relocated to the India Office, which was itself later absorbed into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office complex. It's not a surprise that a painting commissioned by the officers of the East India Company occupies a position in an official building of the government of the United Kingdom. The government of the 21st century continues to use many of the insignia, institutions, and monuments that were created in the days of its empire. And in that sense, the government keeps alive the memory of an old empire. Nor is it a surprise, of course, that a former imperial capital such as London is filled with memorials to empire. And in that sense, the city resembles Beijing, Istanbul, or Madrid. This painting, the East offering its riches to Britannia by Spiridione Roma of 1778, is merely one of many imperial creations that has continued into the post-colonial present, where it resonates with contemporary concerns and serves as a reminder of an epoch when the company was a going concern. The painting's classicizing features refer its viewers back to ancient Rome. These are typical of the late 18th century, but in this case are put at the service of the ambitions of the powerful company. A description of this painting appeared in Gentleman's Magazine in 1778. And this description gives us a very good sense of some of the details in the painting. So I'm going to read this out to you very quickly, which, as I say, is from Gentleman's Magazine in 1778. The principal figure, this figure here seated, represents Britannia seated on a rock to signify the firmness and stability of the empire, and as guardian and protectress of the company, who are denoted by children behind Britannia and overshadowed by her veil. The union of the old and new companies is expressed by two children embracing each other, one of them placed sitting on the upper part of the rock to show the firm basis on which the present company stands. On the other part of the rock, the child climbing up towards the summit is intended to express the prospect of the company's continuance. Britannia is characterized by the usual emblems of the shield and spear, and guarded by a lion which lies tamely by her side, pleased with the offerings made her from the different East Indian provinces. At the foot of the rock lays the genius, that is to say the spirit genius in the old-fashioned sense of the word, of the Ganges, in a majestic attitude, pouring out his whole stream on Britannia's footstool. The various provinces are represented under the conduct of Mercury, who is here towards the right of the painting, the god of merchandise, eagerly pressing to deposit their different produce and manufactures before the throne of Britannia. Calcutta, the capital settlement of the company in Bengal, presents a basket with pearls and other rich jewels which Britannia receives. China is characterized by jars of porcelain and chests of tea. The produce of Madras and Bombay by a corded bale. Bengal is denoted by an elephant, palm trees, and a camel. Persia appears at a distance, bringing silks, drugs, and other effects, and with are supposed to be supposed all the rest of the provinces, which the artist could not describe on the canvas without crowding or destroying the whole composition and harmony of them. The distance is an Indian, you can see the ship here in the distance towards the middle, is an Indiaman under sail laden with the treasure of the East, an emblem of that commerce from which both Britain and the company derive great and singular advantages. As I said, was a description from 1770 of this picture. Few images illustrate more dramatically the gentlemanly capitalism of the company itself, images in national enterprise and its political and mercantile ambitions across the seas. As the riches of India, China, and Persia are made available to Britannia, who from her elevated perch looks down on the connection there. I hope can you hear me still? Yes, you can. Okay, good. The gestures of the Eastern, shall I share the picture again? Let's do that. Okay. The gestures of the Eastern figures are those of presentation, that is obeisance and offering, as if these riches were being eagerly and respectfully tendered to the company. Calcutta presents, Britannia receives, as one contemporary description has it. The movement across the painting's horizontal axis is thus of giving and taking, with jewels and pearls on offer, and Mercury, the god of commerce, extending his staff in the direction of Britannia. Hovering discreetly in the back and center is the ship that conveys these valuable commodities back to Britain, while Ganges, an almost indifferent figure in the foreground, allows his waters to flow beneath the elevated Britannia. Roma's painting was commissioned by the company and aimed to please its patron. A preliminary drawing made in pencil, pen, wash, and signed by Roma suggests that he was asked to make certain changes to his original design, presumably to accommodate the wishes of the directors. The design was brought closer to an existing marble chimney frieze, which was about a related theme, Britannia receiving the riches of the East, and which had adorned the director's courtroom in Leadenhall Street since about 1730. One critic writes, the finished painting is altogether more classical in conception with a greater degree of symbolism. The theme has also changed, and Britannia now dominates the scene. The preliminary drawing is missing Britannia, Mercury, and the Lion, among other things, and does not show Calcutta offering its riches either. The directors were plainly seeking a more classicizing idiom for the painting, and they chose to emphasize their contribution to the nation by asking Roma to alter his initial plans. They wanted to be remembered by a painting that was more classical, more evocative of older histories than the initial design of the artist. The painting used to be a fixture in a building that had been constructed over another image, an image which served as a marker of the Roman Empire in Britain. A mosaic dating from the Roman era was found underneath the premises of the East India Company, to the surprise of 19th century observers. This mosaic is of earlier date than most surviving mosaics from Roman Britain. And it shows us Bacchus riding on a tiger rather than the more usual spotted leopard, referring to the myth that the god visited India. And again, just to quote quickly from the catalog description of this, it's the central roundel from the mosaic pavement. Dionysus's torso is outlined deep red and shaded with flesh tones of pale pink and white, and rests on a cloak which is tied across his right shoulder. It's worked in blue and turquoise glass tesserae. In his left hand, Bacchus, Dionysus, holds a thyrsus upright. That's the staff he's holding. On his head, he wears a wreath of vine leaves shaded turquoise and red, tied with a dark gray headband. During the 19th century, the owners allowed the fragments to be stored in the open air, and the condition deteriorated. And though the tesserae are in their correct positions, according to the early engravings, the present smooth, polished surface represents Victorian conservation rather than the original Roman appearance. Appropriately enough, notes the British Museum, to which the work was transferred in the 18th of the god's journey to India. Appropriately enough, we might say, the mosaic shows a memory trace of the Roman presence in Britain coming back to the surface in a century when Britons increasingly compared their own empire to the Roman Empire, when they came to think that they were displacing the Romans as the most powerful empire builders on earth, and when they were consolidating their hold over the Indian subcontinent. It has often seemed to me far easier, Sheldon Pollock says, to argue that it isn't those who forget the past who are condemned to repeat it, but on the contrary, those in Ayodhya, Belfast, Jerusalem, Kosovo, or Washington who remember it. And this makes it clear that we have not made much progress in understanding the advantages and disadvantages of history for life. Pollock adds that the comparative study of empires shows that empires become imperial, that is, empires are made by the action of looking at older empires. Historical empires stoke the flames of aspiration as much as they hold up warnings to would-be imperialists. Empires often proceed by imitation, and most successful colonialists, from the Achaemenid Persians to the French and the British, have displayed an awareness of older exemplars and an inclination to follow or surpass them in conception and in detail. Indeed, a great deal remains to be said about the practice of imperial mimesis, about what provokes it and what succor it draws from historical memory. But there's something in Pollock's claim that resonates uncannily with the Freudian concept of compulsion, and this resonance is worth another glance. Pollock himself does not treat Freud in any detail in his discussion. He looks at historical phases where empires are driven to mimic other empires, and he asks how the world might move towards a new future, a kind of empire that might finally end the numbingly repeated imitations of empire. For Pollock, a possible way to avoid imperial repetition and to progress to an age without imperialism lies in such models as the Sanskritic cosmopolitanism of Bharatavarsha and the Islamic cosmopolitanism of Al-Hind, which suggest, however faintly, some alternatives. Unlike Freud, who seldom offered the salve of utopia to his readers, Pollock appears to be saying that were we to look back to precise historical periods and concepts, we would be able to forge a community in the future that was less imperial and more egalitarian and more peaceful than the empires of recent history. Pollock is writing as if imperial cultures produce unified historical memories, but we might consider how appeals to such memory are also contested and fraught. We need look no further than the grand historical narrative by Livy. This is the Roman historian Livy, who writes in the 1st century. We need look no further than Livy's grand historical narrative of the war with Hannibal in order to examine the use of historical memory and the repetition of the past. In book 28 of Livy's great history, Publius Cornelius Scipio is maneuvering to be sent to Africa to finish off the war against Carthage. But there is resistance from some quarters in the Senate in Rome, and especially from Quintus Fabius Maximus. Fabius denounces the suggestion to send Scipio to Africa and brings up historical examples to reinforce his point. That's the Latin text. Let's move on. This is the English translation of Livy. Time would fail me. This is Fabius speaking in the history of Livy. Time would fail me if I should attempt to enumerate the kings and generals who have rashly invaded the land of their enemies with disastrous defeats for themselves and their armies. The Athenians, although their state had great foresight, leaving a war at home, crossed over to Sicily with a great fleet under the leadership of a young man as energetic as he was noble, and in a single naval battle permanently ruined their prosperous state. But I recall examples that are foreign and too ancient. Let that same Africa of yours and Marcus Attilius Regulus be a lesson to us, a striking example of good fortune and bad. As commentators have noted, Fabius initially uses episodes from the past to suggest parallels with the present, so that Athens is meant to evoke Rome, Alcibiades, the Athenian leader, political figure, is meant to recall Scipio, and Sicily is meant to recall Carthage. But then he moves on to the example of Regulus, which is in his own implication a parallel that is both suitable and unsuitable. There are a lot of stories told about Regulus in Roman history. The most famous is that he remained in captivity in Carthage until he was sent to Rome on parole to negotiate a peace or an exchange with prisoners. So Regulus goes to Rome. He goes back to Rome. The Carthaginians let him go back to Rome. But when Regulus gets back to Rome, he says to the Romans that they should reject the proposals of the Carthaginians. And he insists that he be sent back to Carthage. And he's sent back to Carthage, and he is promptly tortured to death. That's the memory of Regulus that most Romans would have had in their mind. Scipio, who Fabius is attacking in this passage, pounces on the ambiguity of this example, and he offers us a response. And Livy also gives us this response, and these are Scipio's words now. He states that Marcus Attilius Regulus was captured in Africa, as if Marcus Attilius met disaster upon his first landing in Africa. Also, Fabius does not recall that even that unfortunate general found the harbors of Africa nevertheless open to him and conducted a remarkable campaign in his first year, and in the eyes of Carthaginian generals remained undefeated to the end. You shall not frighten me, therefore, by the example you give. If that disaster had been incurred in this war, not in the former war, if recently and not 40 years ago, why, after Regulus's capture, should I hesitate to cross over to Africa any more than to Spain after the Scipios had fallen? But we must hear likewise of the Athenians how, neglecting a war at home, they crossed rashly to Sicily. Scipio thus repudiates Fabius's mentions of historical events by redirecting these events to serve his own arguments. What is interesting is not just that Fabius undercuts the force of his own examples, but that Scipio represents history as unilaterally favorable to his invasion of Africa. He rejects the trauma of the Sicilian expedition and the death of Regulus. Scipio seems to be complicating the Freudian notion that a trauma in the past may lead to the repetition of trauma in the present and future. Freud observed that past traumas improperly processed through memory lock an individual, and we might say a culture, into endlessly repeating destructive behavioral patterns. Yet, Scipio is also alert to Fabius's rhetorical strategy and recognizes that the other's historical examples are intended to terrify him. He refuses to admit that the example of Regulus signifies humiliation or defeat, and points out that Regulus was successful in the first year of operations against Carthage, and that he remained undefeated to the end. Scipio not only casts doubt on Fabius's interpretation of Regulus's actions, but also says that he would cross over to Africa, even if Regulus were captured in the present war. We might say that Scipio anticipates those who will say he is in a state of denial. He is clear-sighted about the threat from Hannibal and responds to Fabius by saying that even if the trauma of Regulus were to happen in the present, the Romans under Scipio's leadership should fight back aggressively and go to war against Carthage. One of the interesting features of this exchange in Livy from the vantage point of the reader is that Scipio's future success against Hannibal vindicates his stand and charges Fabius with the failure to understand properly the historical memory of Regulus's death. For Scipio, the best response to the ambiguously traumatic precedent of Regulus is military aggression, which is, of course, precisely one of the central drivers of imperial expansion. And Scipio's emphasis on imperial aggression returns us to a theme I touched on near the beginning of my paper when I referred to Oliensis's double reading of Virgil's Aeneid and Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. Oliensis reminds us that the almost complete excision from civilization and its discontents of imperial expansion, imperium without end, empire without end, imperium sine fine, as Jupiter terms it in his promise to Venus in Book 1 of the Aeneid. Of course, the excision of imperialism is not complete in Freud's book, which underlines the role of aggression, however repressed and sublimated it may be, in the building of civilization and community. In this context, it's striking that Freud quotes from a play by Christian Graber about none other than Hannibal near the beginning of his text. Hannibal's last words before he commits suicide in the play are, "We cannot fall out of this world," a sentiment that Freud tries to connect to the oceanic feeling that he is analyzing in the book, a feeling that he associates with the all-inclusive, undifferentiated infantile ego. And if Freud attributes this feeling to the infant, he also implies that the mature individual cannot let go of the dream of complete immersion and possession that accompanied the infantile version. On this reading, the sensation of Roman imperialism is the feeling of aggression shown by the mature adult, as I was saying earlier, who unconsciously recalls the infant's experience and does not want to fall out of this world. The adult longs for the plenitude and pleasure of that early state, but has had to repress these aggressive instincts in order to function as an adult in civilized society. The spillage of these aggressive drives in adult human beings is partly what leads to war and imperialism. It would be a mistake to infer from Scipio's behavior or from the historical memory of Rome that aggressive military imperialism is always with us or somehow inevitable. That is surely not the implication of Livy's history, or for that matter of civilization and its discontents. But what these texts do suggest, perhaps, is that empire calls for aggression and draws on historical memory, and that empire joins both aggression and memory in distinctive ways. Among other things, Livy and Freud teach their readers that remembering the past is not merely sufficient to avoid repeating it, and that what we remember is often shaped by the cues of the moment. Memories of empire are variable, and the way we stitch them together are the result of present exigencies. The lesson for us appears to be that people within a community may frame their memories in different ways, and that the union of memory and aggression often serve the ideologies of empire. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Thanks very much, Professor Vasunia, Phiroze, for a splendid journey across time and across various kinds of theories, both of memory and of empire. I have been asked and given the honor, but also the challenge of saying a few things for perhaps 10 minutes or 15 about your lecture before opening the conversation to all those who are here with us today, or as many as we can accommodate in the time available. So let me try and use these short remarks to perhaps open some issues and questions, giving an extempore comment on a subject whose specialized basis is truly remote to me, is daunting. But in the spirit of the liberal arts, which are so under assault these days, I will try to say some things, but I should say two things by way of finding some perch or purchase in your remarkably interesting inquiry. One is that my PhD degree, and not many people know this, and even fewer care, but it's relevant now, I think, was not in anthropology, which became my discipline, but in a very strange department called the Committee on Social Thought, which was the only PhD program of which I'm aware in the US or anywhere else, which was like a great books program at the PhD level. Almost a contradiction in terms, but we had to read some version of the great books, necessarily in translation, because we were not classicists. And I have to say, since you're a classicist, that we had teachers like the great David Green, James Redfield, the son of Robert Redfield, people who knew the languages, the classics, and so on, extremely well, but it was not expected that we should. So we read them in translation, but nevertheless, we were encouraged to think about the broad sweep of time through great works. And that early training still helps me to respond and react to such interesting talks as yours. The other comment is that very early in my career, I've had a big interest in many of these issues and published an essay, now deservedly obscure, with the title "The Past as a Scarce Resource," about some struggles over the telling of history in a very small religious environment in Madras, a temple, but arguing about the patterns that you could see when people invoked, if you like, their past as priests or as donors or as worshippers, groups that were actually in conflict. But they had to, speak about history, and they did so over very different spans of time with different ideas about continuity and credibility and evidence and so on. And I remember thinking that what this showed me is that even if the past is always in some ways at the service of interest in the present, the point made by people like Malinowski about myth and so on, while true, it's not a limitless or open canvas. But the question becomes, then what are the constraints? You can't say anything you like. If you're, let's say, a British emperor or ruler or a director of the East India Company, or if you're a Roman general, you can't just make up, millennia of history that justifies something you do. You have to work within some constraints of what is plausible or persuasive or whatever. So your talk today reminded me that that is a perennial challenge. That is to say, what defines the boundaries of plausibility in what otherwise looks like a completely open game, because the past is an open thing. And though it's supposed to have limits because it's done with, in fact, it's entirely open to claims and counterclaims, as you also delightfully show with Livy and others, that there's always room to say, no, that's not right. And so that means the past is always like the galaxy expanding. But still there are rules or constraints about what you can say without looking completely ridiculous. So I was thinking about this throughout your talk, and it's the frame for a few specific things that I want to just put before you and our audience to consider. The most striking to me point was, or insight, was this kind of telescoping backwards of empires, Britain to Rome, to Greece, to Persia, and probably lots of little bus stations in between where people invoke this and that. But these are the big players in your story. And also the invocation of Shelley Pollock, Sheldon, who's a very dear friend, and whose argument in this regard about imitation, repetition, and so on, I both know and I like a lot. So it's a very interesting connection, but you invite us, therefore, by doing this, to think about how empires look back to each other in one or other manner. And one question that opens is this especially an imperial thing? Or is anybody who wants to make a claim about the past prone to finding likenesses in the past, say religious leaders or others? Or is there a special kind of Freud and Livy component to empires or to emperors or to the historians thereof, whoever they may be, such that they are peculiarly prone to a kind of, let's say, disorder, to invoke Freud, which is a disorder of compulsion, repetition, all those Freudian terms of which we know. Is there something there which is about this form and therefore points us to a pathology about desire and aggression, which is in empire, but not in other formations, let's say democratic formations? So let's just take Mr. Trump, hopefully the ex-president very soon. Is there something like that, really, even in Trumpism, which is not imperial in any obvious sense, or in other formations you could think of today in the world? Erdogan, who's invoking the Ottomans, joyously, as is the whole country. Is that the same kind of thing, or is it something to do with authoritarianism? So this is both a question for your Freudian angle, where you talk of the desire and aggression, which is a beautiful insight, but to ask whether it's only in imperial formations, or is it in all kinds of formations which are political, and maybe in non-political formations too, like the family. When people in families say, how it was when I was a child and so on, do they also kind of have a micro version of these same tendencies to do some things and not others? And that leads me to asking two other questions briefly. One is that I share very much your interest in this business of the space where memory connects to history, or historiography even. And given the very considerable literature that now exists on remembering, on commemoration, Pierre Nora and this one and that, and thousands of things. And then a certain amount of writing, which is about rewriting history, revisionism, deletion, and so on. I'm thinking that in all your examples, there's a wonderful tension worth exploring in particularly perhaps imperial memories in both the senses. That is how empires remember and how they are remembered, or how we can recall empires and how empires recall other empires or other things. In both senses, whether there's a kind of economy between remembering what you choose to remember and forgetting what you choose to forget, because the forgetting also has to be deliberate. And that latter part interests me very much with all your evidentiary materials. How much of what is not in the picture, not in the mosaic, etc., is just the limits of space, or poor literacy, or oversight, and how much is a choice to say, if I put that fourth horse in, Darius is really going to look too powerful, that kind of thing. And then you can extend that and ask generally, how is the work of forgetting in large-scale histories done, and what drives it? So remembering and forgetting, that's a question that your talk raised in my mind throughout. Final question is a very different one, though I have little things I'm fascinated by, such as the way in which commercial capitalist colonialism dresses itself up in sort of gift-giving garb, as if we're all just doing nice quarterly things. Meanwhile, there's a huge grinding machine, from Lancaster, wherever, the textile stuff. There's had a huge depredation, let's say, of the Indian economy by the East India Company, but it's seen, painted, so to speak, as entirely an economy of gifts, and where natives are giving you this and that. Well, we know that's not the whole story, but it's doing some work. I'll leave aside that, but go to my big one, which has to do with two big issues. One is very articulate in your talk, namely the backward deliberate effort to imitate and therefore resemble various predecessors, or to use predecessors as cautionary tales. Don't do this because otherwise you will die in Carthage, kind of thing. But either way, some kind of backward looking. And then there is also the comparative thing, where people are not looking backward exactly, but if you like, sideways, the Greeks looking this way, that way. That's an old thing with Herodotus, being much more interested in Persia and Egypt than he was in the Greeks. He was a genuine anthropologist. He didn't care about home that much. But that's an old impulse. That is a comparative impulse. And my question or interest is how philology, in fact, the general field in which your training is, that is how to read Latin and how to read presumably Greek and who knows how many other things you read, how many other languages, that the growth of these capacities over time, which then somewhere in the 18th or 19th century presumably turn officially into philology, archaeology, and so on, but which have predecessors, way back, when the Romans, for example, were trying to read and study the Greeks, they had to know something about languages and translations. How much that enterprise affects your interest? That is the fact that there's a big offstage machinery of reading, knowledge of languages, translation, debates about proper evidence, texts, so on, which affects greatly how, let's say, Britain looks back to Rome from, say, how the Greeks may have looked back to the Persians, because they're presuming, because by the end you come full circle. The Greeks are looking at the Persians, and then the British are learning Persian, in India, William James, etc. So I'm very interested in that machine, which is I know something you are deeply steeped in, but slightly off stage in your talk. Obviously, there's only so much you can cover in 40 minutes, but it intrigues me that there is a growing, some apparatus which mediates these references backwards, whether to resemble or to set yourself off. You have to know something, and that knowing is not casually accomplished. So I wonder, Phiroze, though we have probably many people who want to ask questions, whether you want to say a few words in response to my thoughts. Feel no obligation. You can also put them in, as it were, in delete or in the other, some other appropriate boxes, trash, spam, and we can go right on, or take your choice. It's your day.
Well, first of all, thanks very much, Arjun, for your very perceptive observations and comments, as befitting a graduate of the Committee on Social Thought. There's so much to say in response to what you've just said, but I think in the interest of time, as you say, and with a view to the possibility that there might be other questions as well from others, maybe I'll just respond to one or two things, and then we can open it up and take other questions. I think one of your points, one of your points was about forgetting and the relationship between remembering and forgetting, and what gets left out as well as what gets left in.
Yes.
And of course that's certainly a very relevant and pressing issue connected with the ones that I was seeking to explore in my paper as well. You'll remember that it was, I think, Renan who said that nations are built on forgetting as much as they are on remembering. Yes. And it's what you choose to forget, to leave out, to obscure of your national traditions, your histories, your past, that matter as much as what you choose to include in your commemoration of your own nation and the telling of its histories and its activities and accomplishments. And there's a very interesting and powerful dialectic there, precisely between remembering and forgetting, and that's partly the reason for bringing in Freud into this discussion. Although I would add that Freud certainly doesn't exhaust the possibilities for explanations of forgetting. So, I mean, from a psychoanalytic perspective, one might say that the reasons you're forgetting X is because it's something in your childhood, or it's a repression. It's not forgetting, it's repressed, and you're suppressing this memory. But I don't think, I admit that may well be an implication of your remarks. I don't think that that's the full explanation, certainly for what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget in these discussions, and this is tied up on a large scale to the questions of nationalism and national histories, but of course it ranges the full spectrum from individuals to mythologies to national histories and so forth. Perhaps I could talk a bit about your last point as well about philology, but maybe I'm hesitating. Should we?
No worries. We have others, so maybe we should bring some others in. Though I would love to. We can always continue this exchange by other means.
Okay, and if the opportunity provides, I'll attempt to bring it up in responses to other questions.
Absolutely. So let me flag two questions that I see on my screen from two of our colleagues, and there will surely be more, but you can perhaps then take these two together, Phiroze. So the first is from my old and dear friend, Dr. Kamala Ganesh, who says, and I'm conveying a question here, that she found it a fascinating methodological exercise, neither completely or exclusively historical, nor exclusively or strictly psychoanalytic, with a very vast or broad canvas. And her question, she says, is very mundane, although it's not so mundane, I see. How do you select, as she puts it, the paintings and arrive at your insight? So it's a method question about your evidence. Let me just quickly, should I read the second one and then you can take them both in order, since there are only two on my screen at the moment. The second question is from Professor Vijayalakshmi Usha, who says she does her research on historical communities in South India. I see that in general, people connect their memory with either the Ramayana or the Mahabharata to gain certain respect and identity for the entire village. When I researched such a village and studied the inscriptions there, I realized that even medieval emperors had ingeniously played around with such memories to play politics. What is your opinion on that? So these are the two questions from Dr. Kamala Ganesh and Dr. Usha Vijayalakshmi. And I'll keep an eye out for the others, but take your time, Phiroze, with these.
Okay, sure. I wish I had a good answer to either question for that matter, but also to the first one about how do you select the paintings and arrive at your insights. And as you pointed out, yes, the methodology is neither completely historical nor psychoanalytical, and that was, as I was saying earlier, a deliberate choice to draw on what one might find useful from Freudian psychoanalytic background, but not only draw on that in these comments. Well, I mean, there's if I may say, a banal explanation, which is that because my training is in classical Greek and Latin, I was looking for threads that allowed me to see the hold that classical traditions have on later culture, starting with antiquity and going into the present. So I was trying to understand the power of these particular kinds of classicisms, and that was partly the motivation behind these particular selections. So the Romans are already creating the Greeks as a kind of classical culture already. So by the time of Virgil is so indebted to Homer and to other Greek poets that, and the Romans are so enthralled of classical Greek culture in general, that Greece is being constructed as classical already in the time of Roman antiquity. And then I was thinking relatedly about how the British Empire, as Arjun was also saying, in the 19th century, especially powerfully, looked back to the Roman Empire for inspiration, for motivation. There were these repeated comparisons made by Britons between the Roman Empire and the British Empire. And there were the British civil servants in India often had classical backgrounds, members of the Indian Civil Service, the ICS. They saw themselves as Roman administrators and procurators and provincial governors running the Raj, and they say so pretty explicitly in their writings. So partly, I think it was an attempt to understand how and why this dialectical relationship between a classical culture and the observer allows the formulation of a response. That is to say, the response is made possible through an engagement with this particular kind of classical culture, and that's partly what I was trying to understand, and that's why I was selecting those materials. One could easily, of course, choose other materials and other paintings and other images and texts and arrive at other conclusions as well. The other question, though, Arjun, I'm afraid I'm forgetting the question that you.
Well, I can tell you quickly. I think it was
the Mahabharata. I think.
Yeah, it's about the role of what inscriptions, medieval inscriptions in South India about villages, on which Professor Vijayalakshmi has worked, also involved emperors, in her phrase, playing with memory. In other words, they too embed those emperors. And I know a little bit, I've read those inscriptions, eighth hand, once upon a time. I think I know what she's talking about. But I think hers was more an open question about whether that kind of phenomenon is also, part of what you have your eye on, or you would be open to accommodating. So I don't think it was an internal question about your analysis, but more is what she saw also part of the family of things that.
Yeah. Well, I think yes, I mean, I think to the extent that I understand the question properly, I think, yes, I think you're absolutely right to suggest that official inscriptions put up by rulers often in medieval India and elsewhere for that matter, often seek to create an impression or provide a particular impress of a historical record, and that record, of course, is subject to presentation, representation, manipulation, to all the things that we're well aware of. But I think the further point there is that the way in which ancient traditions get recirculated within those later inscriptions is the point of interest. And having looked, for instance, at the traditions of Alexander the Great in India, I think this happens also with him. You often find rulers referring to themselves as Sikandar or Iskandar in their inscriptions. Some of these are Indo-Persian inscriptions, some of them are inscriptions of in other languages as well. There's an attempt to invite a comparison with a predecessor. There's an attempt to inflate the person authorizing the inscription. There's an attempt to project a particular kind of record, a record as well with the past. But yeah, thank you for your question.
So we have now a slew or host of questions which my screen keeps pulling up. So as I'm following one, it's disappearing from my screen, but I think I have 4 or 5. So if you could, I'll just lay them out in a summary form without, with apologies to the askers for not reading the whole, because it'll take up a lot of time. One of the first of these that I had on my screen is from, I believe, Adela. And the question is, both in the past and today, in the big imperialisms that we see, there's this apparent tendency to have some form of democracy at home and some brutal form of empire abroad. Is that some structural element, whether it's with the Romans or with the Brits or with whoever else? There's always some wall there between who democracy is for and who it's not for, which is to say the people you rule, and does that play into it? So that's one question. The second one has to do with myth and memory in relation to the classics. So certainly a rich vein of inquiry. How do those two things play in your thinking or analysis? As a classicist, how do you think of those two things? Yet another is a longer question, but I'm going to go to its core, which is, can you say something about the role of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in nationals epics, that is, as nationalized epics in colonial India, that things that become part of the Indian struggle against the British, so, and how that happens. We then have another, some of these are in fact overlapping. A very short but very interesting question, I think, comes from someone called Nita, put very briefly. History seems to be written most frequently by victors. How much has been written by the defeated? Oh yes, Nita Premchand asks that question. A lovely question. And I may have, did I miss anything so far? I hope not. If I have, maybe somebody will nudge me or move my screen. But this is a big menu. So my suggestion, given where we are, Phiroze, is why not just pick a couple of things from these questions, which are all excellent and clearly provoked by your wonderful talk, and give us some concluding take-home gifts, and then I'll hand back to Meena.
Okay. Could you please tell me how much time we have? As you say,
Yeah, maybe Meena can tell us, or one of the.
No, we have plenty of time.
Oh, we do.
We do, absolutely. I really did expect this would get prolonged. So,
Yeah.
no, so please carry on. I think everyone's.
8 p.m. in India or not?
Yes, it's 8 p.m., but we can go on for another 15, 20 minutes.
Okay,
There's
well,
no,
I
no
think
problem. As long as both of you have the time.
I can go back over these questions because I actually, I see I can move my screen. So let me.
I think I've got the questions you've read out so far. So why don't I start responding to them?
I have got all of them, and if any of the says Indra Munshi says, may I ask a question? And the answer is yes, certainly, Indra. But perhaps we let Phiroze give a response to this list. But Phiroze, should Indra just add her question?
Okay,
And
all right, sure.
Indra, let me invite you to ask your question if you can hear me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you. And thank you for a fascinating lecture and the remarks that followed. I just want to say two things. One is that somehow the question still remains. I'm going beyond memories of just empire, but the question still remains whether it is better for the contemporary society to forget elements of the past or to remember them. You see, there are two viewpoints. One, that you learn from your past mistakes, and therefore you can't just wipe it out of your memory as though it didn't happen. Right. So, one saw that in Germany, a couple of generations just didn't want to talk about, Nazi times. And then there were sociologists who said, no, we must deal with these memories and we must record them, etc., etc. I think the question still remains, what to forget, kise yaad rakhein, kise bhool jaएं. So I think this question remains. Two, and in a way, we are confronted with it today more than ever. The other thing is not just a conscious forgetting, but in the telling of history or in historiography, whether it is by written sources or reconstruction through, particularly in oral sources, there are silences. And I think these are not conscious this is not conscious forgetting, but these are just silences somewhere deep in the communities or the nations or the individuals, whatever subconscious, which surfaces only if it is really dug deep. Now, I'm not a psychologist nor a psychoanalyst, so I don't know. But as a sociologist, I know it from having studied communities, having used oral sources, that they are either too painful to remember or whatever, that it's like it's better that I don't talk about certain things. So I don't know whether it is conscious, it is not so conscious, but I think these areas remain problematic areas. And for me, these are social issues. What does a sociologist or a field worker or a political scientist, historian do in such a situation? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Indra. Both important questions. And now Firoz has also got some time. So if you want me to refresh you or anything on my screen, I can, but floor is yours, Firoz.
Okay, all right, thank you. I'll speak for a bit, but please don't hesitate to cut me off if you think I'm going on for too long or rambling on too much. I'm sure I will probably. Okay, so I believe that we started, one of the first questions was about the relationship between democracy and empire, and the the question of whether democracy can coexist with an empire. This is, of course, a very familiar question. It's in some ways even an old question. It's a question that that was raised about the British Empire in the 19th century. Can you be a democracy at home? Can you be a parliamentary democracy at home and an empire overseas? It's a question that Thucydides asked about the Athenians in the 5th century BC, when he used that exact formulation, that basically saying that the Athenians famously had a democracy at home, but an empire overseas. That is to say, they had their form of limited democracy, which to us probably we would think was very exclusionist because it excluded women, slaves, foreigners. Nonetheless, it was a kind of democracy, but at the same time, they exacted tribute, allegiance, obedience from other cities around the Aegean and around Greece, for that matter. And so they too were reproached for that inconsistency, for that incoherence almost in their political logic. But I suspect that it's not quite seen as incoherence on the part of the mother city, if you will. It's simply taken as the natural state of things, that one has responsibilities and one has obligations and one has duties, and one can be answerable for those within a parliamentary democracy or whatever democratic form of government you might have at home, but still need to enforce a system abroad that is different. This and the problem is real and palpable. It's a problem that Burke felt when he reproached Warren Hastings during the trial and impeachment of Warren Hastings in the late 18th century for practicing a kind of geographical morality. That was the expression that Edmund Burke leveled against Hastings, right? He's saying you go to India and you take bribes and you practice corruption, and then you come back to England and you say you're an upstanding man and not a corrupt figure. And Hastings' answer was, well, that's what he needed to do when he was doing business. I'm caricaturing a very complicated story there. Nonetheless, that's what Burke said about Hastings, and he referred to the kind of morality being very pliable, very mobile for Hastings, and I think that's related to the question of democracy and empire. Many of the chief proponents of enfranchising people in Britain in the 19th century, many people who were thinking very seriously about human rights, about equal societies, were also at the same time, I mean, John Stuart Mill perhaps is one example, were at the same time quite comfortable with their service to the East India Company or to the Raj. So it wasn't really seen as being incompatible. But I mean, there's a deeper question there, is that quite apart from the incoherence, can they coexist? Well, I think history tells us that yes, in a way they do coexist. Although whether you still want to refer to the democracy at home as a democracy is a separate question. can you be called a democracy if you're wielding imperial power outside of your national boundaries? I mean, I think many people would say perhaps not. But whether you can have one form of representative government that then presides over an imperial structure, yes, I think historically, certainly there are many examples about that. I think Shehnaz was asking about memory and myth, which is a very large subject to talk about. I'm not quite sure how to approach it. And it's true, yes, that as you say, Shehnaz, that in India, cultural and religious memory tend to overlap, but I think it's not altogether dissimilar in the Greek and Roman worlds either. That is to say, the religious and the cultural, the mythological and the cultural are connected differently, but they're connected. So this may not quite be what you're thinking about, but there are instances of Greek cities establishing colonies overseas where they do so by invoking their actions through mythological examples, through referring to mythological figures or heroes from Greek myth, gods from Greek myth, stories from Greek myth. So these religious mythological narratives are mobilized to justify political actions, and perhaps that may be what you're getting at. But in terms of the broader relationship about memory and myth, there's I guess a crude response to what you're asking would be to say that distinction becomes problematic in antiquity, and perhaps this is what you're asking. That, for example, if you go back to Greece again, the average Greek on the street in the 5th, 6th century BC probably, most likely, would say that the Trojan War had happened and it took place, and there was Helen of Troy and she was abducted, and Achilles had fought against the Trojans, and Odysseus and Agamemnon and Menelaus and all the rest, all these figures existed historically. They would have said that. So they would have not quite wielded that separation as cleanly as we might do. We tend to say today, scholars today tend to say that probably the Trojan War didn't even happen, that it's a mythological narrative. So despite Schliemann in the 19th century and archaeology and everything, we don't really think that the Trojan War happened, at least not in the way that it is described to us by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. But
if I can just interject.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Because it's a huge, indeed, you're right, it's a huge area, especially for somebody who comes out of class X, which bridged, let's say, anthropology and the study of ancient myth, so on, so much, with so many great scholars. But the thing I was going to say, I'm reflecting on that huge question now, thinking that where myth or mythology, however defined, is a big presence, whether in Greece or whether in other societies much later, to the extent that it is hugely present, what it does is actually take away some of the irritating noise of debates about history. In other words, it says, forget all that. Here's the story. It's our story. Forget about these little details. This happened. We went on Friday. We went on Saturday. That's all minor. The real question is who created fire, who came down from here, who did that. So myth is a kind of police for this unruly proliferation, you might say, of secular historical debates about details. As way it's sort of, and in its pure form, as anthropologists have seen it in very small scale societies, it's more or less the only game in town. It pretty much tells the story of nature, of man, of how we came to this village, who we are. That's all, in that frame of that. Anyway, just to say this, it's a wonderful question, but I did want to flag Neeta's question so that it doesn't get lost about the history written by the defeated as opposed to the victors. And I must ask, is this the Neeta I know from Elphinstone? You probably can't hear me.
Yes,
Maybe.
it is. Yes, it is, Arjun.
Okay,
Very
great.
much. Yeah.
I thought so. I thought so.
Yes, absolutely.
Anyway, that's a minor side point, but I'm delighted that Neeta is also part of this. So her question is a wonderful one. Phiroze, do you want to venture into that space, the defeated as opposed to the winners writing history?
Well, I mean, yes, I mean, a good question, you know, how do we get to the voice of the defeated, even when you could reframe the question and say, given that victors often write history, how can we listen to the voices of the defeated? And I think it's, it's partly through looking for ambiguities and trying to understand why myths proliferate in a certain way or for what reasons. Levi-Strauss famously said that myth turns history into nature. And the question is which particular myths are being naturalized in a way, and for what reasons and why. I found it interesting in that Alexander Mosaic, if I can give you a concrete example, that despite the fact that mosaic is notionally representing the victory of Alexander over Darius, there's still so much ambiguity and indeterminacy in the way in which we might read that particular mosaic. So you could say that notionally it represents the voice of the victorious Alexander and so forth, but actually through those ambiguities in the painting, perhaps we might get a glimpse as well of the other side of what happens to those who've lost.
Again, make a small additional comment, Phiroze, with your indulgence, and thinking about Neeta's wonderful question, that in a way, it's difficult, except by very super close reading and, attention to gaps, or even as what Indra Munshi talked about as silences, you may find things which are not, the kind of official history or the victor's history, the winner's history. But there is another whole archive worldwide from the side of people who became colonized. But it's in their languages. It's African oral histories, of which there are millions, some of which are highly specific historiographic materials. India is packed with material in all the periods I know anything, where the people who are, as it were, suppressed, repressed, subaltern, etc., are doing their own things through sometimes quite official writing, sometimes through oral tradition. So I think this is where Indra's question also comes into play. And I'm thinking that if you look from the time that the Mughals were replaced by the East India Company, 1858, and look at just North India, the entire history of writing in Persian and Urdu, you might say, is the writing of the losers. But they don't stop writing or thinking, so it's partly a question which archive one is paying attention to. And I think in the archive you're thinking about today, it might be very tricky and one might have to, but if you just moved entirely out and say, well, let me think about some archives from the Kingdom of Benin, which then later continues when they are under colonial rule, but they continue to do what they do, tell their stories. So I couldn't resist adding a little further thought for Neeta's wonderful question. I think actually you might say that the history of the defeated, if you take the global story of colonization and empire over just the last 400 years, the modern phase, or the 500 years, European colonialism, the archive of the defeated is probably much larger, but it's not always accessed. It's not always something we know as or find it easy to study, because the materials are often in very difficult places or unknown languages or hard to know things. Anyway, I don't know what your thought is about that, that maybe it's a question of which archive.
Yeah, no, of course that's absolutely true. It's the problem is that for the ancient world, in opposition to the modern world that you just referred to, it's much harder to recover those voices now with the passage of time. And so it's very hard to find, whether it's ancient India or Greece or Rome or wherever. It's for Greece, for example, it's very hard to find the voices of slaves or of women, because the written records that we have are not, by and large, left behind by women or by slaves. So they tend not to represent those voices, which is not to say that we can't say anything at all about slaves.
No, right. I was thinking with the Romans, I heard some lecture which suggested that because Rome had a lot more legal records, and you could see people arguing about citizenship, or somebody speaking in the voice of, a non-citizen, perhaps a slave. I mean, these may be tiny things, but I think they're a little more in the Roman record. I think in the Greek stuff is really very difficult. But let me say, having said this, that now I fear that it being close to the time when my duty involves cooking for my little family, I must take the occasion to thank you, Phiroze, first of all, myself. But I know that Meena will say the important words of thanks. But I wanted to just say what a terrific talk again, and how much I've enjoyed hearing you and how generously you've responded to all these questions. So, Meena, show is yours now.
Could I just say quickly? Sorry, could I just quickly
No,
say?
please do, Phiroze.
No, all I want to say is I apologize for being a bit rambling and not being able to answer all the questions properly. And also thank you for organizing this event. Thanks very much.
No, that's really, I mean, it's we who have to thank you for giving us so much time. And I wish this session could have been prolonged, except for Arjun's cooking duties. But we won't go into that. So I'll just give my formal vote of thanks, which is that on behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, it is my honor to thank you, Dr. Vasunia and Dr. Appadurai, for an incisive and insightful discussion. It has really been fascinating listening to both of you. Thank you for enlightening us. And I have to say that this has been an evening in the true intellectual tradition of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, of which we are very proud. Because really our objective at the Asiatic Society is to enable our members and the public at large to benefit from the wisdom of leading intellectuals like both of you. So we are deeply grateful. I thank Mrs. Vatsala Narayan for her generous support. And as always, our thanks to Dr. Usha Vijay Lakshmi, our Honorary Secretary, for her technical support. And I'm happy that we have so many participants listening in today and actively participating in the discussion. It's really been a wonderful evening. Thank you all. And we can now close the webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Phiroze. I think you've given us, Usha, you can stop the recording now.
Sure, I'll do that.